I'd like to welcome you at our first panel. I'm very glad to chair this panel with three excellent colleagues whose work I have read and deeply admire. Without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser. Cristóbal.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you to Yanis and Giorgos for hosting this event and for the kind invitation to participate. It's my first time here in Greece, so I'm very happy about being at this moment here, which is a very dramatic moment to a certain extent. We will see how it evolves, the political situation here. So I come originally from Chile, so I arrived 2 days ago, I think, in Berlin, then to Thessaloniki, so I'm a bit jet lagged and tired, so if afterwards you see that I'm dying, it's not because I'm bored, it's because the time zone is different than in Greece. So, and I also would like to thank to Joanna, I don't know if she's here around, but she has been very helpful with the organization of the tickets and hotel and that kind of stuff. What I'm going to present here today, as you can see, the title is Populism and Mobilization, and much of my work has been developed with my friend and colleague Cas Mude, who was here a couple of months ago, and we are writing at the moment a short book for Oxford University Press. I don't know if you know that Oxford has this little series called A Short Introduction to Different Topics, and we got a contract for writing a very short introduction to populism. So, and what I will present is a first draft of chapter 3 of that book, which is mainly on the question of the relationship between populism and mobilization. I will not talk today about the definition of populism, and the reason for that is that I think that, at least in this room, or the people that are working with Yanis and with Giorgos, I would say there is an agreement that populism is what they call a discourse, or an ideology, or a set of ideas, a worldview, etc., but we are in the sort of same board about how do we define populism, how do we think about populism. And to be honest, I think this is a great achievement because there is this ongoing debate about how to define populism, and I think that for the organizers, at least, there is a lot of clarity on that, and at least myself and the work of CAS is very, very close to that kind of approach. So let me begin by saying the following. Academics and pundits alike usually maintain that the populist sets of ideas, or the populist discourse, is employed by very strong male leaders who, because of their charisma, are able to mobilize the masses. Paradigmatic examples of these kind of arguments are the cases that you can see here: Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Jean-Marie Le Pen in France, Jörg Haider in Austria, or Pablo Iglesias in Spain. Well, the main argument of my presentation today, and of the chapter that I'm writing at the moment with my friend Cas, is the following. Populist mobilization is not always linked simply to a strong and charismatic male leader. This is very often the case, but it's not always like that. Why should we care about that? Why should we study the relationship between populism and mobilization? And I think that this is a relevant question for at least 2 reasons. The first one is that we need a proper taxonomy about the different sorts of populist mobilization that we can see in different places of the world. And the second one that I think is probably as relevant than the other reason, or a bit more relevant, is that to understand the relationship between populism and democracy, we have to take into account which kind of mobilization are we looking at in different cases. So, and I will try to develop also that kind of argument when I present the main ideas of the paper or the chapter that we are writing. So before I continue, allow me to do a very brief conceptual clarification. By mobilization, I mean the engagement of a wide range of individuals to raise awareness of a particular problem, leading them to act collectively to support their cause. So in this sense, mobilization is used by very different political actors. when mobilization is used by populist actors, what we have is this idea that you try to raise awareness of a particular problem by using the populist sets of ideas in the same way as it was presented before. And what I want to present today is there are three different ideal types of populist mobilization. So the first one is through personalist leadership, and that's what I will call the usual understanding. So a bit what I presented at the beginning. So male, strong leaders who are able to use the populist discourse or set of ideas to mobilize the masses. The second option is through a social movement. And here, I think this type of mobilization is much more common in the US. If you look at the history of populism in the US, it's usually linked to social movements. It's less common in Europe and in Latin America. And the third option that we have is populist mobilization through political parties. And I would say that that's probably the dominant figure or type of mobilization in the European cases. It's less common in the US and in Latin America. So what I will do in the next 15 minutes is to talk about each of these types of mobilization. And afterwards, I will talk very briefly about the interaction of these three different ideal types of mobilization. And finally, I will conclude with some sort of research, open research question that I think should be worth studying. So let's move then to the first type, and that's personalist leadership. So let's think about the key characteristic of populist personalist leadership. So when we talk about that, we are interested in analyzing how a leader uses the populist language to present himself as the embodiment of the popular will. One of the best examples is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. In fact, if you look at the speeches of Hugo Chavez, if you go to YouTube, for example, he very often spoke about saying the following, I am the people. And then you will see the followers of Chavez saying, I am Chavez. So then you see that he represents, to a certain extent, the popular will. So one consequence of that is that when we talk about populist personalist leadership, we realize that there is a direct relationship between the leader and the masses. There are no institutions that mediate that kind of linkage. So Kurt Weiland, a professor in the US, has been written extensively on that kind of idea. Third aspect that is very relevant is that when we talk about populist personalist leadership, we realize that the people are activated from above, and charisma is crucial for that. So we have a sort of top-down mobilization. And the final key characteristic, I would say, from populist personalist leadership is what we realize here is that the populist leader is going to criticize the whole political establishment. And, for example, the typical word here is partitocrazia in Italia, partidocracia in Spanish. You will say all political parties are corrupt. They're not representing the true will of the people. And what populist leaders will do in this sense is to construct a very specific sort of political party, which I will call a personalist electoral platform. So it's not really a political party. What you realize is one leader developing an organization that is fully under his control. Think about Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. I mean, he decides everything what happens within that party. So it's very strong personalist leadership. Let me give you one example from Latin America about that, and the figure here is a guy called Alberto Fujimori in Peru, who, by the way, is in jail at the moment because of human rights abuses. So he was president of the country between 1990 and the year 2000. So if you trace the political campaign of Fujimori, he presented himself as a clean actor who was against the whole political establishment, and he's a real political outsider. He didn't have any connections with the political elites or even with the economics elites of the country, at least at that moment in time. What Fujimori made is to create a personalist electoral platform. So there was a political party behind him, but the political party was fully controlled by himself. And in fact, for each new election, he developed a new personalist electoral platform. The main problem with Fujimori was that he was elected as a president of the country, but he did not control the Congress. We are talking about a presidential system. So because of that, in the year 1992, what he decided is to closed the parliament in what became very well known as the autogolpe, a self-coup. The Constitution of Peru does not allow to close the Congress, but he said, because I represent the true will of the people, and the parliament is run by corrupt politicians, I will close the parliament, and I will govern by decree. And since then, it's very clear that Peru cannot be classified anymore as an electoral democracy, but much more as a competitive authoritarian regime. Why I think that this example is so relevant? Because my impression is that this specific type of populist mobilization, so through personalist leadership, probably represents the best example of a threat to democracy. And the reason is that as soon as you have a very strong personalist leader who uses a populist language, he's going to concentrate a lot of power. And he has then the ability to change the institutional rules of the game, as in the example of Peru. But this is a very specific type of populist mobilization. So it might be the case that the other types of populist mobilization that I will present later on might be not so dramatic, that might have a positive or rather ambivalent impact on the democratic system. Let's move now to social movements. So if we talk about populist social movements, which are the key characteristics? The first one is what we will identify is that the social movement is going to develop a frame that it's based on the populist sets of ideas. Think about Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%, or there is 1%. So that's populist language that you see activated by this populist social movement. What we realize is that in the case of social movements, grassroots organizations are extremely relevant. So in the language of contentious politics, that's what it's normally called organizational resources. What the social movement is going to provide, it is organizational resources, which at the end of the day are very relevant in terms of activating the people from below. So what we have in those cases is much more sort of bottom-up mobilization. And finally, one of the key characteristics of populist social movements is that they maintain a very difficult relationship with political parties. The reason for that is social movements normally do not enter the formal arena of politics. So, but if they want to enter the formal arena of politics, they have to either build a political party or support a political party. And this relationship is normally not very useful. Nevertheless, if you look at many political parties today, they have their origins in social movements. Think about the Greens. Think about social democratic parties. They were attached to the labor movement, at least in their beginnings. So if we think about an example, I would say a good one is the so-called Tea Party in the United States, which started around 2009 after the economic crisis. So what we have in this case is we can observe diverse local and regional grassroots right-wing groups which have very different demands. Some of them are against Obama, some of them are against taxation, some of them are in favor of having guns in the US, etc. But they are all linked together through this populist frame. What we have also in the case of the Tea Party is we do have populist mobilization, bottom-up mobilization, but at the same time, there is support from above. And that's what certain authors and politicians call, that's the reason that they call that an astroturf phenomenon. And in fact, we know that, for example, the Koch brothers, so two millionaires, very conservative, put a lot of money on the social movement. And we know also that Fox News, for example, it's very relevant for the development of the Tea Party. So I'm giving you this as an idea because we see that we have bottom-up mobilization, but at the same time, top-down phenomenon is relevant. And finally, what we observe in the case of the Tea Party is that they have a lot of influence over the Republican Party, and in fact, it's pushing the party into a certain direction. They have developed this funny word called Rhinos, Republicans in name only, so they claim that most Republicans in the Congress are not really representing the true people, the true American people, and they want to have real Republicans, so to say, and not only in name. Let's move now to the third option, and that's having a populist political party. So which are the key characteristics? What we observe in this case is that a new party, or sometimes can be an old party, adopts the populist set of ideas and will present the party as the voice of the silent majority. So that party is the only one who really represents the people and not the other existing political parties. I think what is interesting is that when you think about populist political parties, in my opinion, it becomes very clear that populism is not against political representation, particularly if you think about political representation not only in symbolic terms, as it was said before by Yanis, but also if you think in classic terms in comparative politics. And in fact, you will realize that populist political parties do perform the key functions of political representation, which are mainly three. What do political parties normally in a democratic system? They work on the aggregation of interest, they work on the elaboration of political programs, and they train personnel. And this, in fact, happens when you analyze populist political parties. In this sense, populist political parties are not different from other political parties. They perform political representation. It might be that many people do not like those kind of parties, but they perform the classic functions of political representation. And finally, what we observe in the case of populist political parties is a mixture of both, on the one hand, top-down mobilization by the party itself that is trying to politicize certain issues through the populist language, and at the same time, you will observe sometimes sort of bottom-up mobilization through the constituencies that belong to that political party. So if we think about an example, I think a great one is the so-called Austrian Freedom Party, the FPÖ, which it's a very relevant party in Austria, gets around between 10 and 20% of the vote, and has been since the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, very relevant. What is interesting about the FPÖ is that we are talking about a party that existed before the 1990s and originally was not a populist party. In fact, was what scholars normally call an extreme right party, so attached to a fascist ideology. And Haider came as the leader of the party, and then he moved the party from an extreme right party to a populist radical right party. So this is an example of the transformation then from this non-populist sort of party to a populist one. And what is interesting about that case also is that it's very clear that Jörg Haider has been very relevant for the evolution of the party, but Haider died a couple of years ago, and the party is still there. And in fact, the party is still very powerful. So it's not only that the leader was the key figure behind that, we are talking about a political organization which is very resilient. So and Haider was influent in the party, but the party exists beyond himself. And in fact, it's one of the strongest parties in terms of organization in the Austrian context. And it's not a coincidence that if you analyze how does the party work, you will realize that it has connections to civil society or political society in Austria, mainly through youth organization on the one hand, and to trade unions on the other hand. So let me move to the final point, and that's what I will call a dynamic model, and that's the relationship between these three ideal types of populist mobilization. Can we observe the transition from a populist social movement to a populist political party, or from a personalist populist leader to a populist political party? This is the kind of question that I want to answer in the following 2 minutes. So the first option that we have is the rise of a populist personalist leader who is going to build a political party afterwards. And this type of transition, it's very common in the case of Latin America. So if you think about Chavez, for example, or if you think about Perón in Argentina, these are clear examples of a populist personalist leader who ends up building a populist political party. And in fact, neither Chavez nor Perón are alive today, but the parties that they created do exist and are very relevant in each of those countries. So the second option that we have is a social movement uses the populist sets of ideas and gives rise to a personalist leader who at the end of the day is going to build a political party, or a populist social movement who is going to support a new political party or an old existing one. And I'm not very sure about the examples here, but my impression is that Podemos in Spain is something like that. So think about the Indignados. After the Indignados, you have Pablo Iglesias, who becomes very, very relevant, and then you have the construction of Podemos as a party. And you have Syriza, which I'm not an expert on, so maybe other people can comment, and I'm not sure if Syriza will be a case of a social movement leading to a political party, or to what extent Tsipras is so relevant that helped the construction of a personalist leader who at the end of the day is supporting a political party. So, but again, I think people in the room might know much more about that, so I'm more than happy about hearing about that. So the third and final option is what I will call a circle, and then what we have is a populist social movement that gives rise to a populist personalist leader who is going to support a political party, but at the same time, this party is in relationship with the social movement. And this is a very awkward case, I would say. It's very atypical. And one of the few exceptions is in Bolivia, the president of the country is Evo Morales, and this is a very clear example in which you have these three things together. So you have a very strong social movement, you have a very strong populist leader who is Evo Morales, but Evo Morales and the social movement has been working on the development of a party which is called Mass Movement Towards Socialism, which is organizationally very, very relevant. So let me conclude now, and I come to the final point of my presentation, and I just want to raise two questions that, to be honest, I don't have like a proper answer, but I will try to offer some tentative ideas. So these questions, to a certain extent, I think it's sort of future research agenda. So the first question is the following. Why are some types of populist mobilization more prevalent in some places than in others? To answer that, I think, first of all, we have to think about the political system. My impression is that presidentialism favors the rise of personalist leaders, while parliamentarianism favors the rise of populist parties, for obvious reasons. These are the rules of the game. If you want to win elections in the presidential system, you need a strong leader. If you want to need elections in a parliamentary system, you need a strong political party. Second is you have to take into account party system performance. And what I mean here is taking into account variables as, for example, ideological convergence. So if you have mainstream parties moving to the center, you will generate a sort of representation void that can be used then by either populist political leaders or populist political parties. Think about cases also of party system collapse. Another factor that it's relevant to answer that kind of question is the political culture and to what extent civil society organizations use or not the populist sets of ideas. And that probably will give rise to populist social movements if you have a populist culture that has a proximity to the populist sets of ideas. And now I'm running out of time, but let me finish with the second question. And do these different types of populist mobilization have an impact on the electoral success of populism? And again, it's tentative, but I think that first of all, we have to distinguish between electoral breakthrough and electoral persistence. And I think this is relevant because populist personalist leaders might be very helpful for electoral breakthrough, so that the populist sets of ideas becomes relevant in the electoral arena. But what happens normally is that populist personalist leaders are very bad institution builders. So that's the reason that I would say that populist political parties are very helpful for electoral persistence, whereas personalist leaders favor electoral breakthrough. So the ideal combination is you have a strong leader who is able to develop a strong political party, and then you will have breakthrough, and at the same time, you will have persistence. And finally, in the case of social movements, I think it's much more ambivalent. And I think populist social movements normally have an impact in terms of agenda setting. But because social movements normally are not interested in the formal political arena, they don't have an electoral impact unless they're interested in building political parties. Such is the case, for example, of Podemos maybe and Syriza. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cristóbal, for this very interesting and rich presentation. Now I would like to give the floor to Francisco Panizza from the London School of Economics for a presentation with the title The Populist Mode of Identification, Mechanisms, Reach, and Limits.
Okay. First, thank you very much to Yanis and to all the people that put this brilliant conference together. I don't think I need to tell that people that live in Greece that populism is the politics of extraordinary times, or that politics is the politics when there is no politics as usual. And by that, we mean a lot of different things, but basically the idea of crisis of representation, anti-status quo movement that challenge the existing forms of politics and propose a radical rupture with politics as it was in the past. And I completely agree with that. I think this is the kind of scenario where populists thrive. But in my presentation, I will talk about something that is actually a little bit of the opposite. I will talk about ordinary populists. And maybe the 99% of the intervention here will be all these kind of mobilized, rupturist populists. I would like to talk a little bit about populists in ordinary times or populists in well-institutionalized political systems. Now, very briefly, what I'm going to look some examples of that in relation to Great Britain, where I live and work, but I also like to use that to make some conceptual points about the debate on populism. And I will start by that. In terms of the definition of populism, I completely agree with the definition that is the basis of this project, and it's a definition that, with some variations and nuances, has been adopted lately by many, many scholars of populism. So there is nothing new. I will not elaborate on that. The idea that a minimalist definition, as Yanis was noticing in his introduction intervention, and broadly speaking, with difference of language or whatever, the idea of an antagonistic division of the socio-political terrain between the people on the one hand, the people as the underdog, and the elite, the establishment, the 1%, the casta, etc., etc. So nothing there, just to set in my grounds there. Now, I said that there is a very strong scholarly consensus among people that study populism in some variation of this definition. But it's something also that is quite interesting. People agree on that, but they don't quite agree on what is the point of this antagonism. What is populism for? What is populism about, if you want? And there's a difference I want to mention here. And look at that. These are people that more or less adopt this definition I mentioned a moment ago. But what is populism about? You have Carlos de la Torre saying populism is a political strategy, which I think it is by and large. We have Ernesto Laclau talking it's a political logic. We have said, yes, of course, there is a political logic on populism, but populism is more than a political logic. We have Cristóbal and Cristóbal, a thing-centered ideology. I think that it's not an ideology, perhaps not even a thing-centered ideology, but it has a normative basis. It is an appeal, Margaret Canavan, yes, it is an appeal, but what kind of appeal? It is a political style. Ben Moffitt, what is meant by a political style. So people agree on the one hand, but they don't disagree in what is the point of that. And then, let me just try to elaborate what I'm going to say by looking at this quote here. And this is from what it's a book I read a long time, I've read several times, and it's still one of the best books I have read on populism. It's by Michael Kazin. He's an historian, not a political scientist, and he wrote this wonderful book about the history of populism in the United States. Look at what Michael Kazin says in the introduction to his book. I do not contend that my subjects were populist in the way they were unionist or socialist, Protestants or Catholics, liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans. Populism is too elastic and promiscuous to be the basis for such allegiance. Rather, my premise is that all these people employ populism as a flexible mode of persuasion. They use traditional kinds of expression, tropes, themes, and images to convince large numbers of Americans to join their side or to endorse their views on particular issues. Why did this got me thinking? It seems so simple. I think it has a lot inbuilt there. The first obvious thing, and I'm getting about populism in ordinary times, is that is American politics. We tend to identify populism with systemic crisis. This is a quite highly institutionalized, but also permanently unsettled and dislocated political system. You have these strong political parties, etc., but you always have this sort of distance and this sort of mistrust between the people and those who are in power, the Washington insider, the 1%. So perfect for my example. And he said, I don't think that my subjects were populists in the same way that they were Republican, Democrats, etc., etc. What is he trying to hint there? I think you can interpret it very easily. It means that it's not an ideology, it means it's not a sort of this, but I think he's hinting to something about populist identity that I would elaborate in a minute of that. And what he's trying to say that populism circulates in American political discourse, in American political institutions, permanently and in different ways, in different morphs, in different themes. And that's exactly what I'm going to look at in a little while. The thing I don't agree with Kaizen is he talks about mode of persuasion. I think this is a highly rationalistic view of politics and populism. And I think my own view, I'm going to answer the question of what populism is about. I think populism is a mode of identification. Why is a mode of identification? Well, basically, because if populism, as we saw from the initial definition, is about the construction of the people, it's about the we and with the people. As a political actor, populism is a mode of identification. What are modes of identification? I'm not going to enter into that, and we can discuss it much more, but I just quote Yanis, which wrote one of the best articles on that, books on that, are the material and symbolic practices that constitute and sustain, and that's the interesting point in terms of complex, conflicted, and permanently dislocated identity claims. And what I want to remark and rescue from Yanis' definition is that on the one hand, structures and social norms constitute subjectivities. They assign subjects a place in the social order, the audience, the speakers, men, gay, female, etc., etc. But both structures and the subjectivities that they contract are always already dislocated and incomplete, even in highly institutionalized political systems. So what is specific about the populist mode of identification? And here again, I think like Ernesto Laclau is a necessary reference, even if you don't agree 100% with him. He described the process of contraction of populist identities as based in the logic of equivalences. The accumulation of a plurality of unfulfilled demands, I would say grievances, in face of the institutional system inability to address them, makes possible the setting up of an equivalential change among otherwise disparate demands in antagonists to the institutional order, which, by virtue of their common antagonists, coalesce in the constitution of the people as a potential historic actor. So far, so good. I don't have much to add to that, but even if Laclau offers a compelling account of the populist mode of identification, I think there are a number of problems in his analysis of populism that obscure a better understanding of the different dimensions of populism. And one of that, I think this is actually the second Achilles heel of Ernesto. One is the relation with the leader, and the other is his identification of populism with politics. Laclau equates institutional practice, all the things that happen in institutional politics, that as a reference as pure administration, while conflating relation of antagonists with the political and the political with populism. So anything that happens within an institutional order is not politics, it's administration. Populism is outside the political system, it's antagonism, it is rupture, and it is politics. And I think this is unsustainable. Very briefly, I think that in adopting this kind of Rancière-inspired distinction between the realm of the political and the realm of administration, Laclau is failing to fully take into account the incompleteness of both identities and of the social order in which identities are, to quote William Connolly, interlocked in strife and tension. I think it's pretty obvious, and I can give you several examples of that if I have the time, that any demand, any grievance, no matter how specific, is grounded on some kind of identity claim. A specific demand let's take the case of gay marriage in the Irish Republic a couple of months ago. There was a plebiscite. Possible of being addressed by institutional means can be and often are intensely politically, creating antagonists within the institutional structure. The struggle for the fulfillment involves process of hegemonic construction and challenges to the limits of political order insofar as we understand institutional order not as fully constituted totalities, but as the articulation of a plurality of partially constituted social, economic, political, ethnic, regional, gender system of difference. So there's not a sort of this big order, but a plurality of orders that are in very unstable relation. So basically, to close my sort of more conceptual question, I think that populism is not the same as politics, but populism is a dimension of politics. And as such, also, of course, populism thrives at times of crisis and crisis of representation and extraordinary time. Populist appeal can be both internal and external to a given political order. And the distinction between populist and institutional appeals in an institutional political order is blurred by mainstream politicians' adoption of common discursive ground with populist challengers. The second point is that active within the confines of the institutional order, populist parties and populist leaders shape and change the boundaries of the political debate, redefining what is sayable and hence doable in a given political order. And the third point that I'm going to make here is that the notion of populism as an anti-status quo, anti-systemic discourse of rupture is difficult to reconcile with the reality of populism in operation as a conservative discourse of order enunciated from a position of power within existing institutional arrangements. And I will look at case studies of these three arguments I'm going to make here. And they are, two of them are related to politics in England, in Great Britain. The first one has to do with the distinction that has been made in the recent electoral campaign just before between strivers versus strikers. I don't know if you are familiar with it. Well, strivers, they define it the hard-working people, the people that work hard to achieve something, and strikers are the people that are lazy and don't work. It is quite interesting because when the previous government, the coalition government within the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats came to power in 2010, of course, it was very much still the part of the Great Recession, as they used to do throughout Europe, and particularly in Britain. One of the first things that did the new government was a huge program of fiscal adjustment. And most of this adjustment came in terms of cuts to Social Security. But how they legitimize that? They legitimize that in terms of the slogan, "We are all in this together." That was repeated and repeated and repeated when they were implementing these programs. Meaning by that, obviously, that everybody has to contribute, and this contribution will be shared, so that the rich will pay more, et cetera, et cetera. The basic of their coming to power, the first thing was, "We are all on this together." Pure discourse of difference, if you want to use the jargon of Laclau. And now, 3 years later, Giorgos, the number 2 of the Conservative Party, the Chancellor of the Czech, which is a funny name that they give in England to the Minister of Finance, he was addressing the party conference, so three years after the adjustment. And look at what he says. On the eve of the election, I told this conference, "We are all in this together." It was more than a slogan. It spoke of our values and of our intent, that there would be sacrifices and cuts that would be tough to make, that everyone was going to play their part, and that in return, we will build an economy that works for all. 3 years later, my message remains the same. We are not going to get through this as a country if we set one group against the other, if we divide, denounce, and demonize. We need an effort from each and every one nation working hard together. We are still all in this together. So one nation, the limits of the community are the limits of the nation. Is a kind of anti-populist discourse of difference you would imagine. Just minutes, literally minutes after saying that, Osborne said the following. What is the fairness, we ask, of a shift worker leaving home in the dark hours of the early morning, who looks up at the closet blinds of the next door neighbor sleeping off a life on benefits? So, dividing, denouncing, demonizing. Now, I bring this not because I sort of, it was a passing remark, because this became the center of the political campaign of the conservative government, the legitimation of the welfare cuts, and also put the position in a very, very difficult situation. If they were against, they defended the welfare cuts, they were against the hard-working people, as they defined this, and in favor of these lazy that were living a life on benefits. The Labour Party couldn't get out of that bag, and was one of the reasons they lost the election. So, interesting here, because Yannis was saying this sort of, the anti-populists define the populists, and there cannot be nothing more anti-populist than the Conservative Party in Great Britain, but the anti-populists sometimes, they become the populists. The other question, I said, is how populist interventions circulate between mainstream and populist politicians. A typical populist divide in every country, I would say, is between the ordinary people and those who are in power, the metropolitan elite, the Washington insiders, et cetera, et cetera. In the case of Britain, the signifier of this sort of elite in the last couple of years has been the metropolitan elite. And Nigel Farage, the leader of the UKIP Independence Party, the sort of right-wing populist party in Britain, surprise, used exactly this divide in terms of his appeal. So in a speech in the eve of the last election in May, he urged voters to back the party in the polls and give what he called the metropolitan elite a hangover the day after. He attacked the trendy metropolitan types who run our country, who he said all go to the same university, Cambridge actually should be universities, Cambridge and Oxford, do the same degree, leave university, become researchers, become MPs, age 27, cabinet ministers in their 40s. With variation, you will find variations divided in almost any populist party, any populist leader. The interesting thing is how it is internalized by mainstream politicians, and particularly in the Labour Party that lose election. They said, well, yes, we lost election because we become part of the metropolitan elite. And this is David Lammy, who is an upstart, a rising star in the Labour Party. He said, just in the shock after the election, the 5th, he said, well, when I go to my constituency and go there and talk to cleaners, security guards, home care, dinner ladies, nurses, they don't recognize us because we have become part of the metropolitan elite. So the metropolitan elite, he was sort of recognizing himself of being part of this metropolitan elite. This is internalizing this kind of so traditional populist trope. The third example I would here is how populist shapes the boundary of political discourse in institutionalized party system. And this is here what, in a brilliant article in a book I edited some years ago, Oscar Reyes told the solidarity of the dirty secret. Is that what, quote unquote, ordinary people think, but they cannot be put in public discourse because it's said politically incorrect, et cetera, et cetera. And look at that. In the 2005 election, the Conservative Party, so 10 years ago, put these posters in the street. It is not racist to impose limit on immigration. I can talk a little about how this layout is. The question is there, immigration was almost something that could not be part of mainstream political discourse. It was part of the populist fringe, but not from the mainstream party. And look at what's interesting, what they put them, somebody, yes, it's there, it is you, tourists, come. Now, if you fast forward to 2015, the immigration was at the top of the political agenda in the last election. And Nigel Farage, the leader of the UKIP party, looked at that and very sharply says, this is the biggest single issue facing this country, and accused the establishment of closing down the immigration debate for 20 years. And he says, Because when we believe in something, we don't go, are you thinking what we are thinking? We say it loud. And this is the helpless leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband. This is a sort of a terrible gimmick that he tried. He set in stone the promise of the Labour Party, the same Labour Party that have completely opened the doors to European immigration 10 years later, 10 years earlier, sorry, and there you have about the number 4 control of immigration. So how the populists shape the political debate, and that's, again, how very sharp Nigel Farage said that. But the essence of our recent success is our ability to push the boundaries of the debate, and with that, the nation debate on many issues. So maybe it's not to bring down the political system, but they change the boundaries of what is sayable and doable. I'm going to skip a couple of things and just briefly about populism and the construction of political order. For me, the case of Putin is there in the piece of work which is based mainly on secondary sources. But the idea is that Putin didn't come to power as a typical populist. In his initial years, he mixed populist and non-populist discourse. And it was only later, when he was already in power, he used the idea of sovereign democracy, which he borrowed from some Russian intellectuals, to set up the device between Russian democracy and Western liberal democracy, and between the Russian people and the intelligentsia who oppose him. And the idea is this populist becoming a discourse of order. Let me just very briefly the conclusion. My first one, which the point I was trying to say, that the populist model of identification is part of institutional as well as extra-institutional politics. Mainstream and populist politicians share common populist tropes, themes, and images to different effects, but in all cases, they seek to define and redefine identity claims. It can be used by mainstream politicians to set up the limits of differences, as was the case of Giorgos, and to take distance from political elites without, however, placing themselves outside the very same institutional order to which they belong, as was the case of the Labour Party politicians. These are examples of what the Swedish political science called the banality of populism, but that on the condition that we are aware that banality does not equate to inconsequentiality, as we have seen in the case of George Orwell intervention. Other politicians use populist appeal in a much more consistent strategic way. We tend to call these politicians populists. And this, in the case of Britain, was the case of Nigel Farage, how he set up the floating signifiers European Union immigration to construct a political frontier between the people, metonomically referred as an everyman typical UKIP voter, and the cut-out carriers of Westminster. But on his own admission, Farage's measure of success is not so much the rupture of the political order, but his party's ability to push the boundaries of the debate, as exemplified by the issue of immigration. And last, something that I think is lost in some debate of populism and has been set up remarked by some scholars, is that populism is as much a discourse of order as a discourse of rupture. If this is the case, what is to be made of discourses that use the populist model of identification to reinforce than to question the political order? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for adding this very, very interesting perspective of populist identification. And the last one for this panel is Joe Feinberg from the Czech Academy of Sciences and the Slovak Academy of Sciences with the title The People Constructed Constructs. Joe, the floor is yours for about 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to the previous presenters. It's, I think, good fortune that I'm following Francisco. In a lot of ways, what I'm doing is kind of asking what this we is, that is this we that is the people, as an actor and a subject. And I should say that this will be a presentation will be more about more of a question than a conclusion. But I want to suggest a couple of ways of asking what this we of the people might be. The people in mainstream, or what we might call traditional conceptions of populism, has been understood as primarily as a rhetorical device, a symbol, or an empty phrase, an illusion. The Essex School of Discourse Analysis has moved beyond this, the idea of the people as an empty phrase, as an illusion. It's taken the people as a very serious category, a meaningful node of articulation in political discourse. But similarly, it's the people still figures primarily in a rhetorical capacity as a representation or a node within a system of representations. That's on a both a semiotic, discursive level, the people as either a checklist of symbols, signifiers in one conception, or as the central node of what the people means, or also representation in a political sense, the people as a mode of representing people within politics. What I want to ask is whether the people could be understood not only as a representation or as a node in a system of representations, but also as a mode of representing. So in other words, both as a structured representation and as a structure of practices that produce representation. So in a sense, I'm proposing what Yanis Stavrakakis suggested earlier as additional criteria for identifying or questioning what is populist, or in the term that I will be using rather than populist, I'm turning towards the popular, and maybe it's something to be discussed later, what the distinction is between what is populist versus what is popular, what is populism versus maybe peopleness, and to use a term a neologism in English. So that is to say, I'm looking at the people not only as an object, that which is represented, or a medium through which things are represented, but also as a subject that represents. And I'd like to suggest that by paying renewed attention to the role of the people as an agentive subject, we might help discourse analysis to move past a couple of the theoretical impasses that at least it has allegedly gotten itself into, which again, Yanis mentioned a couple of these earlier. First there's the criticism posed to discourse analysis that discourse theory has been excessively formalistic. So I want to ask if an understanding of the people as a subject offers a way for us to return to content, in a sense, to see the content of the people. So after having rejected mainstream approach that would, or a traditional idea of populism as a kind of laundry list of things that are populist, so content in that sense, maybe we can move back to looking at content in a different sense, what is contained in the people, even in some kind of a minimal definition of the people that would be generally applicable or at least up for debate. The second one of these impasses that discourse analysis has been criticized for getting itself into is this Achilles heel of Laclau, that the allegedly excessive attention paid to leaders and hierarchical centralization. So I want to ask whether by looking at the people as a subject, we can highlight the role of horizontal, egalitarian, and participatory relations in the process of establishing a people that is accepted popularly as such, as being really, for us, a people. And then third, discourse analysis has been criticized for paying too little attention to affect and embodiment. So I want to ask whether the notion of the people as a subject can highlight the role of embodied affective experience in the processes of creating representations that are agentive, that have agency, that act. This this conception of the people as a subject, this is a question I'd like to pose rather than assert, but it seems to me striking that although the people is presented as a subject consistently in political rhetoric, it's very under-theorized as a subject. I think that this conception of this usage of the people in political rhetoric is taken either at face value as true, usually by non-theorists, or as maybe a useful fiction that can be, it doesn't have to be taken seriously, and so again is not really examined by political theory to a great extent. I'd be interested in hearing about exceptions to that. A couple of exceptions I might mention as I go. So, given this absence of, relative absence of a theory of political subjectivity of the people, how might be a way of addressing, of looking at the people as a subject? So, again, let me go back to these three categories of three impasses that the people and theories of the people have faced in this particular moment of the development of theory. If we can return to the content of the people as a subject, I think, is not graspable if we merely list the people, understand the people as a list of separate items. The people is, for example, we have the people when we have a great leader who identifies as being the people, or we have the people when we have a political party that claims to act in the name of the people, and so on. That does not show us how the people functions as an actor. But I think the people is also not graspable as a subject when we see it from a purely formal perspective, as if it were a floating or even empty signifier that takes on meaning only or primarily relative to other signifiers. I think the people can be grasped as a subject that is internally structured, a subject whose actions depend on certain social forms that are internal to it. So we can look at the concept of the people formally, the content of the people formally, look at the form of the content. So not say that the external form, the position, not only the position of the people within broader political discourse, but also the form of the people within itself. So what is that form? Political rhetoric answers the question, I think, readily, not without certain contradictions, but we can look at political discourse and find things like clear statements that the people is egalitarian, the people is cooperative, the people creates and acts collectively, no one within the people stands above the others except as a symbol of the whole. In this respect, there's an obvious and yet very productive and long-lasting tension between the people's representation in leaders and parties, but in populist discourse, this is consistently a part of a discourse that says that leader who appears to be above the people is actually below or part of the people. So this egalitarianism, I think, is central to this discourse of what the people is internally. But political discourse does not investigate the meaning of this answer that it provides to the question of what the content of the people is. Now this is where I will turn to one body of theory that won't have been raised very often in this conference, but folklore studies is one area of research that does look at the content of the people, and has proposed means for identifying, defining, judging material as popular or not, according to the way this material was created, according to the form of organization of the people that produce this material. So what I'm suggesting is that we can use, among other potential sources of theory, this body of theory, folkloristics, folklore studies, that have been developed for aesthetic, semiotic material. We can use it for addressing these political problems, for understanding what not only aesthetic production might entail, but also political action. And I would argue that there's more than a homology between folklore and democracy, or folklore and politeia, folk, people, demos, polis, and what is created by this people. I'd suggest that this is not merely metaphorical or coincidental, that these differing terms refer to different aspects of the same or interconnected process. So now, when we see the people as a collectively creating subject, its content then can appear as a set of egalitarian processes of making meaning, making aesthetic value, making social reality. For example, these are processes that folklore studies, for example, identifies in looking at and trying to identify some material as being folklore. But I'm going to purposely state them at a very general, abstract level, because I think that in many cases the same process can be applied to aesthetic projects as well as political action. So, for example, processes of freely sharing information, processes that enable multiple participants to influence the shape of collective creations, practices that minimize the authority of individual authors, that attribute works to anonymous or collective creators, practices that encourage participants to continually rework material that comes to them, to reshape what they find to be deficient, to add what they find to be lacking, and to pass on to others what they've made so that others may continue to remake it. For theoretical analysis now, the point is not to establish a fixed set of criteria and to then insist that reality correspond to these criteria. To establish theory as the arbiter of popularness or peopleness, as the authority that can decide who and what the people definitively is or is not. The point, in my view, is to draw attention to the existence of criteria like this, and to the fact that that what the people is continually contested, and these are the kinds of criteria that are already being used when people contest those criteria. So I might pose one set, someone else might pose another. When theory is able to identify criteria like this, we can point to where I think a crucial argument lies, where it's already been taking place in some sense unbeknownst to us, and can enable us to enter the fray. So formal theories, or what I might call externally formal theories of the people, they might identify certain figures that fit formal definitions. But the people that is identified in an externally formal theory might still be called into question on the basis of other criteria. So I think even the minimal definition of the people that we've seen proposed, which may be entirely adequate for scholarly identification of populist discourse, any given people identified in that way might at the same time be called into question on the basis of other criteria, might be called not a real people, not an authentic people. The authenticity of the people is a continually recurring issue in question. Formal claims regarding the position of the people are perpetually open to the criticism that those are mere claims, that what they refer to is not really the authentic people that we're looking for. It doesn't conform to the popular ideal. So we could also think about this issue in terms of effectiveness. How effective is a given people in persuading its people to consider it to be the people? Some modes of expressive communication and collective action might be more effective than others in producing representations that are accepted as popular, as belonging to a people that is not only represented by others, but which itself represents. Now, in conclusion, to briefly address the third of the impasses that populist theory may have gotten itself into, the impasse of affect, which, as Yanis mentioned earlier, was something addressed by Laclau at the end of his life, and Yanis himself has proposed some ways of addressing the issue of affect in populist discourse. This is maybe yet another way to look at the question. Since the process of representing is also a process of participation, its effectiveness depends in large part on the experience of participants. Participants judge representations to be popular or not according to whether the representations seem to arise from an authentically egalitarian and participatory process, rather than arising, for example, rather than being imposed, for example, from above, or being compromised by market interests, et cetera, et cetera. So, though the experience of participation is involved in representation, it necessarily also involves more than representation. It's also a process of embodied activity, because the participant must feel that he or she not only observes the people externally, but also is an integral part of the people. Must feel that they're a part of this we that is the people. So by looking at the people as a subject, we might also provide discourse analysis with a way of approaching and incorporating the immanentist anti-representational conceptions of emancipatory agency, such as those proposed by Hart and Negri, the multitude, and so on. I don't think it's necessary to pose affective participation against discursive representation as if they were mutually exclusive opposites. I think the challenge, rather, is to understand how the people can appear to be and to contain a process of participation in social structures of affectively laden representation. And then maybe we could look not only into the people's mind, but also, so to speak, into its heart. That is to say, we could try to understand why the people provokes love and fear, how its signifiers may not only be empty seen from one perspective, but may also be full of people who feel themselves to be participants in the people. They, the people, and sometimes we, the people, are the people's value-laden content until that moment when they or we reject it and leave it empty and maybe find a new people to be a part of. Thanks.